This unit covers American imperialism, and this specific lecture covers the origins of that imperialism, where we got our idea to go out and be an empire and take over territories. Question 1. What factors and ideas led to the growth of America's desire to acquire an empire? So, why is it all of a sudden we wanted to become an empire? What were the things that made the United States kind of abandon its traditional policy of focus only on the United States and all of a sudden decide to go out and not only be involved in the rest of the world, but also to dominate certain areas? There are several different reasons. They're up here in no particular order. The first one are business interests. Businesses during the Gilded Age were growing. We've talked about how the big businesses and how they grew kind of exponentially. And as blessed as the United States is to have raw materials and resources here, there are certain raw materials we do not have. Becoming an empire would provide us with easier access to certain raw materials, such as rubber, things that cannot be grown here. The businesses also saw any colonies or territories as potential markets for their manufactured goods. Once the goods were produced by them, they could easily send them back, and whether you're getting raw materials or sending manufactured goods, because it's part of the United States territory, there would be lower tariffs, lower import taxes. The military also had its reasons for us to become an empire, not just because they're going to be the ones going out and doing it. The military and the government was starting to see the United States as a world power, something that we had not seen ourselves as before the Gilded Age. As a world power, because we were geographically isolated from pretty much the rest of the world, there would be a need to expand the Navy, and thus give us the ability to project force around the world. So the Navy wanted to see us become an empire, because for the Navy that would mean more budget money. It's a very simple materialistic reason. A man named Alfred Thayer Mann, this is him right here. Alfred Thayer Mann was in the Navy, but he was also a historian, and Alfred Thayer Mann wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power. It was a study of the British Navy in the 1600s and 1700s and what it was that had made the British Navy so powerful. His book came to the conclusion that if the United States wanted to be a world power, if the United States wanted to have and maintain an empire, then the United States had to build a modern, powerful navy, what the British had done. Every time there had been a revolution in naval technology, the British had basically scrapped their old fleet and built a new one. And he said that's what the United States had to do. So the United States had to focus on building a modern navy. There were also people interested in spreading Christianity, and so there were religious interests in this. Part of this was the idea that the United States, our goal, our special mission was to civilize the rest of the world. Sometimes this is referred to as the white man's burden. And don't think of this as a joke. Think of it seriously. In order to understand it, you have to think of it seriously. The United States and Western Europe are kind of the pinnacle of civilizations. They're the ultimate in what was called Christendom, the Christian world. And so if you felt that you had been especially blessed, and you've been blessed by God, and you look at the rest of the world, all of a sudden you realize that the rest of the world does not live in the same conditions we do. They don't have Christianity, they don't have the trappings of modern civilization, and so it was our job, our command, to spread that and to improve people's lives. Okay? We had to spread Protestant Christianity, not just Christianity, but Protestant Christianity specifically. And so missionaries are really going to be involved in this issue. There's a man named Josiah Strong. Josiah Strong was a preacher who felt that it was the United States special mission to educate, civilize, and bring Christianity to the backward peoples of the world, as he put it. People who believed in social Darwinism also felt that being an empire was kind of part of the United States special mission. A man named William Graham Sumner, he is actually the guy who came up with the term survival of the fittest. And it's not Charles Darwin, it's Charles Darwin's theories, But William Graham Sumner came up with that term, survival of the fittest. In his view, survival of the fittest also means rule by the strongest. The United States is one of the stronger powers in the world. Therefore, it is our responsibility to go take over. If we are not taking over, we are shirking our responsibilities. Another reason people wanted us to become an empire, and this one may seem strange to you, was the fact that the United States no longer had a frontier. This goes all the way back to 1890, when the government would do the census every 10 years. They would take a big map of the United States, basically, and they would put pins in it and look at, okay, where do people live, where do people not live? The difference between those two areas, they would draw a line, and that became the frontier, the edge of settlement. And every time we did the census, from 1790 all the way to 1890, that frontier continued to move further west. Okay? Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian, and he looked at the census of 1890. The census of 1890 is significant because, for the first time in U.S. history, they did the census, they put the pins in the map, and they looked for where to draw the line, and there was nowhere in the United States, in the continental United States, that was unsettled. This was a psychological shock to people because the frontier was gone. We had always had it. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote this thing called the Turner Thesis, sometimes called the Frontier Thesis. But whatever, in his paper, he argued that the United States needed a frontier. This had been part of the United States. We had grown up with it. It had always been there, and we needed a frontier for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was a social safety valve. If you failed in New York City, you failed at life, you could always move west and start over. If you're a new immigrant to the United States, you could always move west and start over. So the frontier also provided an incentive for exploration. Right? People were exploring west, of course, but he also argued that it also provided the opportunity for innovation, kind of exploration of the mind. Because there were people who, they may not go west, but they would be inspired by the people who were going west. And while that may not be what I want to do, what can I do to push the boundaries of what we know? He also argued that it was important to the American character for us to have a frontier. That, again, this had always been a part of America, and so it had always been something we do. Go west, young man. And so in order for the United States to continue to be great, we had to have a frontier. He also felt that the presence of a frontier separated us from Europe and what Europe was. Europe never had a frontier, he argued. The closest thing they had to a frontier were the American colonies, but we took on our own character. And so he said having a frontier separates us from them and keeps us separate, which is interesting because he's going to argue that we have to go get a new frontier, which is going to involve going to places and taking over, which is what Europe did. So what kind of empire did people think we were going to have? What did that mean? Well, our only experience really had been with the British Empire, and it was argued that an American empire would not be like the British Empire. We would not have direct control. A lot of people argued that our empire would be informal. We would not have to station troops. We would not directly tax territories or whatever. While it would be necessary to have a few areas that the United States did directly control, most of what we would have would just be independent places that would kind of listen to us. This would be less costly than the British Empire. It would keep us from having to raise taxes too much. We would instead try to create protectorates. A protectorate is a country that is technically independent, but it really doesn't do anything without the United States telling it what to do. The United States holds kind of a veto power over its actions. So I've jumped the gun. There's the definition. our focus would be mostly on the Western Hemisphere, so Central and South America, and the Pacific. So we're going to be looking in places, if you can see kind of in the background here of the map, okay, we'll be looking at Mexico, Central America, okay, South America also, and then throughout the Pacific, while you have a lot of islands, we'll also be looking at, you can barely see it over here on the edge, trading with China, and we'll also be talking about Japan. Questions 2 and 3. How did the Monroe Doctrine guide U.S. foreign policy through the 1800s? And how would you characterize the organization and planning associated with American expansion in this period, which is roughly 1820 to 1895? Again, if you need more time to write down these questions, you can always pause the video. Okay, so our expansion overseas through the 1800s, what did that look like? In 1823 is the first time we're kind of involved with any major foreign issue, unless you want to count the War of 1812 as part of that. But in 1823, we issued the Monroe Doctrine, which, if you'll remember, that declared the Americas off limits to European intervention and colonization. In 1853, our next major step was it involved Japan. Japan in the 1700s, as the European powers are going off and they're finding territory, they're making connections with the rest of the world, Japan had decided to become isolated. They decided that the Western world did not really have anything that they needed. They felt that Western values were corrupting the traditional Japanese values. Well, in 1853, the United States sent Matthew Perry. He's a Commodore in the U.S. Navy. They sent Matthew Perry to open Japan to trade with the United States. He sailed into Tokyo Bay and said, I am from the United States. This is my big battleship with lots of guns. We want to trade with you. And the Japanese agreed. And you can look at it as the idea of we threatened them with force to trade with us. But you also have to look at it from their point of view. Europe had nothing to offer them in the 1700s. In 1853, the United States shows up with what at that point would have been a modern, powerful battleship. And to the Japanese, some of their reason for trading with the United States was suddenly these people have something worth trading. And all they want in exchange is silk, other things that we have in abundance that are not nearly as valuable to us as the new technologies. Once Japan was open to trade, that required us to find islands out in the Pacific to use as way stations. A way station, think of it as a gas station for the Navy. An island that's going to house food, coal, anything else you need on your voyage. In 1864, another big thing that the United States was involved in 1864, France invaded Mexico. Because this was a blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States threatened to go to war with France. We were in the middle of the Civil War, though, so it was still just a threat. By the time the Civil War was over, France had been defeated by the people of Mexico anyway, so there really wasn't a reason. But the United States had still asserted that Monroe Doctrine and said we're willing to go to war to protect it. In 1867, our Secretary of State, William Seward, maybe you remember him, he was Lincoln's Secretary of State, he arranged for the purchase of Alaska. Alaska had been owned by Russia, and in 1867, Russia was trying to get rid of some of its territorial holdings. It was too expensive to maintain Alaska. So the United States had always kind of had a policy of if someone has territory out in the Pacific, we would offer to purchase it if they were willing to sell it. And the same thing happens here. Sometimes this is called Seward's folly. A folly is something that is so stupid you can't help but laugh at it. It's called Seward's folly because when you think of Alaska, what do you think of? You think of ice, snow, polar bears, Eskimos, Sarah Palin, something like that. And that's what most people think of in Alaska, and that's up in here. What Seward was looking at, though, Seward really didn't care about the interior of Alaska. Seward was thinking more about this right here. These are the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutian Islands, they're part of Alaska. I think officially Alaskan territory stops right here. Okay. But they're part of Alaska, and then Alaska also covers this part of the coast of North America. Okay. Canada, this is not Canadian territory right here. This is actually Alaska. And what Seward was thinking of, he was thinking of how can we make it easier to trade with Japan. If you're in, say, California, and you want to trade with Japan, typically you have to, you'd think you just sail across the ocean. Well, that requires a lot of resources on your ship for the voyage. If instead you could go to port here and pick up some supplies, and then hit the coast of Alaska and pick up supplies, and then continually doing that way you're not having to fill the entire cargo hold with supplies, then suddenly Japan is very close. And it makes it easier to trade. In 1867, the United States also purchased the Midway Islands, which are out in the middle of the Pacific. In 1889, we started trying to assert kind of our dominance over the Western Hemisphere by proposing this thing called the Pan-American Union. We called a meeting of the countries in the Western Hemisphere and asked them to kind of follow our leadership. There's not much that came from it. One of the legacies of it, though, was kind of an increased suspicion of U.S. policies and plans among the nations of Central and South America. In 1895, we kind of have gotten to a point where we truly feel we are a world power. In 1895, there is a dispute between the nation of Venezuela and the nation right next door to it, which was at that point called British Guiana. British Guiana, today it's just called Guyana. It is a country there in South America. It's right next door to Venezuela. But at that point, it was owned by the British Empire. It had been one of their colonies. Don't think that they had taken it over. But they had never been able to figure out the boundary between Venezuela and British Guiana. And in 1895, there is a dispute. This territory that it had been kind of in dispute, but it's no big deal, all of a sudden, someone found gold. And all of a sudden, it became extremely important that they settle that boundary. Of course, Venezuela wanted it, British Guiana wanted it, because whoever got it was going to have access to the gold. When Venezuela would not negotiate the way Britain wanted them to, Britain threatened to go to war with Venezuela. As a result, the United States then threatened to go to war with Britain, asserting the Monroe Doctrine. You cannot do this. This is a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And if you'll remember back to the creation of the Monroe Doctrine, it was actually the British who not only suggested the original idea, but once it was announced, had also agreed to enforce it from 1823 on. So all of a sudden, we are asserting, no, we are going to use the Monroe Doctrine, and we will threaten you, who have been doing this great favor for us. Britain, not wanting to go to war with the United States, asked us to mediate the dispute, kind of act as a third party who could objectively look at the issue. The results were we mostly sided with the British claim, so British Guiana got most of that disputed territory. And that didn't help our image in South America because it looked like the Anglo countries were just sticking together, which is probably a lot of what it was. So obviously Venezuela was upset, but everyone else also continued looking at us with suspicion. Question 4. Based on the map, what were America's main goals in terms of foreign policy and territorial gain? Notice the top of that's going to be cut off. I'm going to enlarge the map here. It'll be cut off. The title will be cut off on the next slide as well. But basically the title says United States Acquisitions and Annexations, 1857 to 1904. Okay. Mainly what we're looking at, what I want you to do for the question is answer during the 1800s. What seem to be our goals, what seems to be our purpose. Okay. The orange is what we control, obviously. And then the dates are what year did we actually gain control of that thing. These green areas over here are also territories we didn't directly control, but they were protectorates. Right? They kind of do what we tell them. If you need to pause to come up with an answer, feel free. Question number 5. How did Hawaii go from being an independent kingdom to an American territory through the 1800s? And what you'll be doing with this question is, once we're done with the explanation, kind of give a brief synopsis of what happens. Okay, so a little bit of background on Hawaiian history. What was going on? It was discovered, quote unquote, by the British in 1778. Okay. So the British don't find it until 1778. Of course, it had been discovered, hundreds of years before by the Polynesian peoples. I think something I read, the earliest archaeological evidence of humans on Hawaii was about 300 A.D. Unlike a lot of the places that the Europeans found, Hawaii was able to maintain its independence. So instead of it being someone's colony, it really was the Kingdom of Hawaii. Through the 1700s and the 1800s, Hawaii, because it's situated kind of in the middle of the Pacific, again, if you can look here at the background map, it's right about there. It's a perfect point for navies and sailors to use as a way station, as a place to rest and relax. And so it was increasingly used through the 17 and 1800s. By the time you get to 1820, American missionaries are going to Hawaii and actively working there to try to convert the Hawaiians to Christianity. Now, one thing I read said that they found a kind of a willing population, a group of people that were willing to accept Christianity. Of course, the same thing had happened to them as happened to the Native Americans. When foreign sailors arrived, they spread disease. The population, was decimated. And so you have a bunch of people that are questioning their religious beliefs, and here come people with a new religious belief. Okay? You believe in this religion, and your population is shrinking. We believe in this religion, and our population is growing. Okay? And so the Hawaiians were receptive to that message. As far as Americans in Hawaii was concerned, the more Americans showed up, the more influence they gained over the Hawaiian government. Several of the Hawaiian chiefs converted to Christianity, and so they relied on their religious council. Over time, the descendants of those original missionaries, some of them, of course, continued in ministry. Others got involved in business. Not every missionary family is going to have kids that want to go out and be missionaries. Some of them do want to get into business. Some of them have other pursuits. But they stayed there in Hawaii, and they became advisors to the kings of Hawaii. And as a result, they had a lot of business. They had a lot of influence. American businesses opened up on Hawaii. One of the largest American businesses on Hawaii was actually the growing of sugar cane. And they had large farms. They had these large sugar plantations. Remember, a plantation is not a place where they have slaves. A plantation is a large farm. Okay. The American South is characterized by slaves, but in Hawaii, of course, slavery was not necessary in Hawaii. In 1849, the United States officially recognized Hawaii as being independent. In 1875, the United States made a treaty with Hawaii. The treaty allowed sugar grown in Hawaii to be imported to the United States free of tariffs. This is a big deal, because all of a sudden, for the sugar plantations, it would be more profitable to sell the sugar in the United States because you wouldn't have to pay the tariffs, which, if you look at it from a business standpoint, what's good for the business is good for Hawaii, or at least that would be the characterization they would give to the king. In 1887, the United States got another treaty with Hawaii to use this place called Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is a deep water port. That means your ships with a lot of draw, your ships that displace a lot of water, can easily come in and can dock right up on the shore almost. Keeps them from having to stay a mile or so out and kind of bring people over by rowboat. Right. You are going to need to know Pearl Harbor at some point anyway. Now, all this stuff led to the growth of Hawaiian nationalism. Nationalism is pride in your ethnic group. Over time, as the Americans gained more influence over the kings lost that political and economic power. Some of it is very subtle, some of it is very early on. But whatever, the people of Hawaii started to fear the American influence, and they started to demand that the United States turn things back over to them. In 1891, this woman named Queen Liliuokalani ascended to the throne in Hawaii. She became the new queen. Her brother had died childless, and so he left the throne to her. Well, Queen Liliuokalani, and you may, in an essay, you may refer to her in an essay in class as Queen Lily, if you have trouble spelling that. Queen Liliuokalani was a Hawaiian nationalist, and she wanted to reclaim Hawaii for the native Hawaiians. And so Queen Lily, when she became queen, she sought to remove some of the special legal protections that had been given to the Americans living there in Hawaii, and she sought to reclaim power for herself and for her kingdom. She wanted the Hawaiians to regain control of their own affairs. Well, that didn't sit very well with the Americans, who enjoyed this special privilege that they had, and so they started a revolution. January of 1893, the Americans staged a revolution and asked for United States support. They went to the, you can call him an ambassador. He really wasn't an ambassador. He was the U.S. minister to Hawaii, so he was a representative. They went to him and asked for support from the Marines. There was a group of Marines that were actually on leave in Oahu. And so these Marines, under the direction of the U.S. minister to Hawaii, helped support the revolution. Right? The U.S. minister in Hawaii then recognized this new government that had taken power from Queen Lily and arranged for the Marines to continue to protect it. Immediately after forming the new government, and immediately after declaring themselves their kind of in charge, this new government asked the United States to annex Hawaii as a territory, to officially annex it as a territory, not just as a country with special privileges. The President of the United States at the time is Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland, he's the one Democrat in the Gilded Age. He's the guy that served the 2 non-consecutive terms. He refused the request to annex Hawaii. He believed that what had been done to Queen Lily was not only wrong, but that it was flat out illegal. And he said to annex this would not only be supporting an illegal act, but it would also be, it would lower the estimation of the United States in the eyes of the rest of the world. Okay. Congress went in to investigate, and they started investigating the overthrow, and there were conflicting results. One group, the Blount Report, who investigated it, they said the overthrow was illegal. Queen Lily was the proper monarch of Hawaii, and she needed to have power returned to her. Another group called the Morgan Report said, look, everybody but the Queen are the ones that are not guilty of causing the revolution. It's the Queen's fault. Okay, so, kind of blaming the victim kind of thing. In 1896, we will talk about this election in 1896 of William McKinley. He was an imperialist, and so with that kind of a change of the political power, with a new president, it brought about the idea of annexation again. Finally, in 1898, so during McKinley's first term, Congress did go ahead and annex Hawaii. And it remained a territory. It wasn't a state until 1959. So even when the Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor in World War II, Hawaii wasn't a state, it was a territory. Question number 6. What message is the cartoonist attempting to convey about the U.S. annexation of Hawaii? And once again, I'll blow the cartoon up here. Maybe I won't. I guess I'll just have to show you what it is. Here we have, this is McKinley, kind of acting as the priest here. We have the native woman who's labeled as Hawaii, kneeling down next to Uncle Sam, of course. Behind, we have this guy. This is going to be Senator Morgan. And, of course, you see him with the shotgun here, another shotgun wedding with neither party willing. Talking about these two parties here. Question number 7. What was the basis for America's policy toward China? What did we want to accomplish in China? China in the late 1800s, okay, we're talking about the other side of the Pacific. China had a very weak central government. So they're not the China of today. Territorially, they're pretty much the China of today, but not the government that was in charge. And throughout the 1800s, the powers in Europe had used that weakness to carve China up, not into European territories, but into these things called spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is a part of a country, part of one country, where another country has special privileges and rights, almost to the point of that second country is actually in charge. But officially we say that the parent country is in charge. And what the Europeans were doing with these spheres of influence is they were limiting trade with foreign countries. And so they were kind of creating their own little monopolies. Right? This is a good example of what those spheres of influence were. Here we have this the Chinese guy throwing his hands up, screaming, "Stop, what are you doing?" And here we have all the European powers cutting up a piece of the Chinese pie. Okay, this is Queen Victoria of England. We have a German, a Russian. This woman represents France. And then you also have the Japanese. The Japanese had an area of sphere of influence in China as well. Okay. This is a better map showing you who controlled what. Okay. This was controlled by the Japanese. They got it in 1905. This area they had held earlier. The Russians controlled the northern areas. The British, this kind of middle band here. The French controlled down in here. So really this middle area of China, and there are some maps that actually restricted only to about right in here. They said that the British and the Russians actually controlled this. This area right in here, that's really all that China controls. That's really all the Chinese government control. In 1898, a group of Chinese nationalists got sick and tired of this, and they started this thing called the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxer Rebellion lasts 2 years, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to get rid of the foreigners, get rid of the imperialists. And so they would kill missionaries, they would attack foreign business interests, whatever. And the Chinese government was kind of powerless to stop them. So what happened is the foreign powers, Britain, France, even the United States, sent troops to go help the Chinese government put that rebellion down. Now when that happened in 1900, once the Boxer Rebellion was crushed, there was fear that these foreign powers that now had lots of troops in China would use that to just say, you know what, you can't control it, it's ours. So the United States proposed this thing called the open door policy. Okay. The open door policy was kind of created by new Secretary of State John Hay. And what he asked was he asked these European nations to do two things. Number one, provide all nations with equal access to trade in and with China. Okay? This idea of fairness. Number two, as a result of that Boxer Rebellion, prevent any one power from formally taking over China. We need to work together not only to trade, but we also need to work together to keep each other in line from taking over. Once the Boxers were defeated, once the Boxer Rebellion is over, he kind of reiterated this request and said, this is the policy we need to have. No one really wanted to go with this. You know, they felt that the Chinese were unable to control the Boxers. They had lost businesses had lost money, people had been killed, and so the United States also guaranteed that the Chinese government would pay for all the damage that had been done. And kind of the way that guarantee worked is the Chinese will pay. If they don't, we will make the payment for them. So you will get your money. Well, again, you know, people were kind of hesitant to go along with this. You know, if you're Britain, you have a good thing in the area you control. You don't have any competition. Italy was really the first country to agree to it and say, this is a great idea. And if you go back to the map, you'll see Italy's not on there. So, of course, Italy thinks this is a great plan. They'll have access to China. And based on Italian agreement, we kind of declared that the open door was in effect, and we began trading in China and, in a way, kind of dared anyone to stop us. Eventually, everybody else in Europe kind of figured out that this could end up working out in their favor because they could go into areas that they hadn't previously been able to. And so everyone else agreed, or at least accepted, the open door policy. That concludes our presentation. Be sure you've read this, be sure you've listened to this before class, and we'll see you in class probably tomorrow, since I know you're looking at this the night before.